Welcome to the fourth annual Untermeyer Garden Lecture, and I'm Ann Carmel. I'm chair of the board of the Untermeyer Garden Conservancy, and a great-granddaughter of Samuel Untermeyer. So it's been a great privilege to watch the transformation of this incredible garden. And of course, we owe it all to Steve, Timothy as well, but Steve is here to talk about what it was like and what it will be like. So welcome to Steve, and thank you all for coming. One short plug. We're privately financed, so I just, you should keep that in mind as you watch what we still need to do. So,
good evening. 100 years ago, Samuel Untermeyer completed the construction of Untermeyer Gardens, called Greystone. So we are now celebrating its centennial year. He wanted it to become the finest garden of the world, and you'll see in a moment that we see in a letter to Herbert Lehman that he, in one part of the garden alone, he spent $1.5 million in the walled garden, which today would be the equivalent of $31.2 million. Anne, I'm so sorry, but it shows the gravity of his ambition. This photograph is not of Untermeyer Gardens, although it could very well have been. It is Angkor Wat. But as you see, there are great places in the world that become the victim of all kinds of abuses in the passage of time and nature, and Angkor Wat is certainly one of them. The sack of Rome is another. This is Samuel Untermeyer when he was all young and bushy-tailed. Beautiful portrait in the collection of the New York Historical Society by Anders Zorn. This is a photograph of him as an older man on the cover of Life magazine. I'm not going to get into all the history of the garden because that's not really the purpose of it, but needless to say, he was one of the most successful lawyers in America. He, as great a lawyer as he was, he's probably even a better investor, so putting the two together, he did very well, and was, a lot of people in that time, this is the great period of country house gardens. Rich people, today you own a Picasso or you buy a basketball team, but back in that day you built a great garden. And probably most of the people who built the great gardens as status symbols really didn't know that much about it, but Samuel Untermeyer was a rare man who really knew almost as much about all the plants and their taxonomic names as his gardeners did, so he was passionately committed to his garden. This garden was a world-famous garden. It was open to the public one day a week for 25 years. People came from all over the world. We know that in one day 30,000 people came in 1939. This was the mansion that was built by his predecessor during the Civil War, John Waring. This is an article from a Baltimore newspaper calling it in the 1920s America's most spectacular garden. This is, in fact, the day. In October 29th, a crowd of 30,000 persons today visited the garden. This is from the New York Times. You hear stories that, surely are old wives' tales, couldn't possibly be true, but now you can actually research things pretty well with the New York Times archive. So, 1939. So 1939 was sort of an interesting year. This was the year before Samuel Untermeyer's death. In October, later in the month, 30,000 people came. In October 8th of that same year, a few weeks before, one of the great bronze sculptures by Paul Manship was stolen, the Actaeon. There's an article about it here. Untermeyer hired additional armed guards. He erected more iron fences around the property. This is a year before he died. And thankfully, they found Actaeon buried in a hole near a garage in New Rochelle. And it was recovered a couple of months later. But this was beginning to show, like already even in Untermeyer's time, people were starting to look at it and with covetous eyes. Also that year, this is a letter from Untermeyer to Governor Lehman. Greystone has cost me in one way or another in the neighborhood of $5 million. I spent $1.5 million in the construction of the Greek garden alone. And the place is filled with rare trees, shrubs, and thousands of rhododendrons, which render it unique. It supposedly had the greatest rhododendron collection in America. There is nothing in the country like it, and of course it is not a local affair and should not be so regarded. And of course this is the critical thing that he was trying to avoid, and as it happened, New York Governor Lehman decided not to accept it as a New York State property. Westchester County decided not to accept it as a county property, so it fell to the city of Yonkers to become a municipal property. And it is difficult for any city to maintain something of this magnitude, but even Untermeyer back in the day could foresee that that would not be what should happen. Mrs. Untermeyer and I gathered the statuary in the park for the past 40 or 50 years, up to the time of her death, from all over the world. So this also occurred in 1939. This is an email that I received from a man who lives in Florida, who grew up in Yonkers, and he remembers it in the 1940s. He said, a side note here about the garden statuary. As a child living on Bellevue Avenue, I would often explore what were then the woods. One day, probably in the late 1940s, we came upon a group of abandoned buildings whose doors were wide open. I thought the abandoned buildings may have been part of the estate. Such were the architectural similarities, and most astonishing of all, the actual contents of the building. Scattered all around were toppled statues and garden ornaments, along with boxes and boxes of documents and canceled checks, all of which meant very little to us at the time, but which I now understand to have been the remains of the day, so to speak. The sadness of it all still haunts me. I met a woman who also in the 1940s probably sort of broke into one of those buildings. She's a very old woman now. And what she told me, what maybe these boxes were, she remembers going in there and there were hundreds of blue ribbons on the ground. He was a very avid horticultural competitor. And so he entered in all these competitions. So all the blue ribbons he won were just scattered all over the floor, all just disappeared. But this is sort of what happened shortly after. The family actually maintained the garden after his death until around 1940. The world was, World War II was going on, and the city finally acquired a small portion of it in 1946, and that's when it started going downhill. This was a fountain in front of the mansion, which many of you probably recognize. It's called the Dancing Maidens by Schott, a great German imperial architect, which Untermeyer bought with his wife when they were visiting Berlin. This is after the death of Untermeyer in 1940. The family gave it to the city of New York. This is in the Conservatory Garden in Central Park, 104th Street. You go through the gates, go to the right, called the Dancing Maidens. If you look very closely at the round stones around the sculpture, that is what's there today. That is the rim of the fountain, which now has a flagpole in the middle. All the garden apartments across the street were owned as open land by Untermeyer, where he had agricultural lands as well as a dormitory for unmarried gardeners, of which he had 60 full-time gardeners. There is the fountain today in Central Park, looking magnificent on its original base, but in an oval basin, not a circular basin. That is the mansion. You just point out one little thing. There's a little sculpture there that he bought from the estate of John D. Rockefeller, which he moved to a different place. So that is what the photograph of the mansion in his day, and that is the site of the mansion now. So this is the fountain basin. That's where the mansion was. Behind the mansion were various stairs that went down to a beautiful terrace. And we have a number of very amusing photographs from a family that one or two of them were servants. So I think the Untermeyers may have gone to Europe or whatever, and all the servants are like taking pictures of themselves, clowning around in the gardens. So this is them, acting as lord and lady of the manor. back, in one of the back corners of the back terrace, that is what it looks like now. And on the other corner are remnants of the other balustrade going down. This is a shot probably during the height of the Depression when Untermeyer was reduced to only 35 full-time gardeners, down from 60. But there were tremendous floral displays that were put on that changed yearly. Here's another one here. Look at the sculpture in the back. You'll learn more about that later. It's an ancient sculpture. Wonderful dance performances took place. All kinds of cultural events took place during its periods of glory. And by the way, during this lecture, it's the glory and the sack. So I'm going to be going back and forth from glory to sack, and it'll be kind of jarring sometimes. But this is during the glory period. These are actually the Isadora Duncan dancers, and they did come and perform not only in the 20s, but in the 30s as well. This is a different dancer. This wonderful shot. One of them was a pretty well-known dancer. I don't remember her name now. This was in the 30s. This is the period of the garden, again, when it was new, about 100 years ago, in the Architectural Review, in an article that featured not only the Untermeyer Gardens, but Keiket. It was about Wells Bosworth. Remember, Wells Bosworth was the architect, and it was an architect. It was an article about what he had done for Rockefeller. Then it led into Untermeyer, and of course, Untermeyer hired Bosworth to outdo Rockefeller, which he did, in the garden world anyway. These are the sculptures which are still there by Paul Manship, one of two sphinxes, and there were two bronze sculptures. These are they. So this is Diana from the back, and this is her bow. This recently sold for almost $1 million. There were a few images of them made, and this is Actaeon. This is the one that ended up in a dump in New Rochelle. So this is a picture again of the garden when it was new, showing the wide open view which we're trying to recover. Again, the pool at the basin of the Temple of the Sky. This, at the foot of the pool, is a sculpture of the Apollo Belvedere. And again, you know, these were great bronze sculptures or marble sculptures that are reproductions of great classical sculptures, were probably made by a foundry in Naples, that, along with many, many of the sculptures, has disappeared. All we have is a bit of the plinth. Oops. Another shot of it. Mrs. Untermeyer was quite well connected in cultural circles. This is a letter, 1910, to her. She was one of two people who helped rescue the New York Philharmonic, bringing in Gustav Mahler to become the conductor. And he said, "I miss your presence so very much at the rehearsals and performances. The invisible ties between me and the profoundly discerning, kind listener endure, and I long for the opportunity to reknot them. Hoping to be able to greet you soon in our midst in all your former liveliness and capacity for enthusiasm, Gustav Mahler." He only led the New York Philharmonic for about 1.5 years, and then he got sick, and she took him to the boat to take him back to Vienna, where he died. So she was quite close with him. This is, again, there were many, many fabulous events that took place. This is a musical event, 1914, had a special train leaving Grand Central Station. Another event taking place later that year, 1914. Minnie was the president of the American Society of Poetry, and there an annual poetry reading that took place in the gardens, all kinds of famous poets coming. This was in the East Stoa. This is what you saw from a far distance. And this is a sculpture of Aphrodite, an ancient sculpture. After Samuel Untermeyer's death, there was a huge auction of his belongings, and it is listed here as important Greco-Roman sculpture of Aphrodite, 3rd through century BC. So we don't know what happened to it, but again, this is representative of some of the real treasures that were in the garden. Another piece in the garden that was in the catalog and My treasured board member, Barbara Israel, who's a garden expert, we're not quite sure. There's a feeling that this might very well be a 20th century reproduction of a medieval wellhead. What's very interesting is you can see the rope marks that you would have in a well, but in the reproductions made in the 20th century, they often put in simulated rope marks. So we don't know. This is just in the woods. At the end of the garden, the main walled garden, there was a Venus surprised. The whole end of that garden has crenellated walls, and at each crenellation there are these waterfalls of chrysanthemums that were put on during his annual chrysanthemum show. I mean, if you go to the New York Botanical Garden, you see the great chrysanthemum show that's done there. It's a huge attraction. Untermeyer did something the equivalent of it as a private citizen. This is a period photograph, again a lot of these are, showing the Apollo Belvedere, the Farnese Hercules. This is the Temple of the Sky, again a big marble sculpture. We'll see it in a little video in a moment. This is the Bronze Runner. Again, this is a reproduction of an ancient piece which is in Naples, found in Pompeii. And next to that, we think this is a neoclassical interpretation of a gladiator. This was opposite the Bronze Runner. Then there are garden elements that we don't even know where they were. We think this might be the Four Seasons, but it looks to have been a hexagonal or octagonal building. I don't know where it was. It's so far gone. And similarly, here's a great garden bench. We don't know where it was, but these are the same servants who were frolicking that weekend. On and on, the sculptures go on. This is one, I don't know, maybe what this classical expert can tell us what it is. There's some little deer or fawn here, but it just goes on and on, these 40, 50, 60 sculptures. I'm not going to show them all to you. This is very interesting. There was an ancient Roman relief that was in the walled garden, and it was there as late as the 60s. This is a picture taken in the 60s. The young boy who is shown here may very well be in the room. I know he bought a ticket. It's with his mother, and he sent me this photograph, but already you can really see the tremendous deterioration of the garden. There was a flat roof over this part of the garden, and not only is the roof gone, but all the framing's gone. It's open to the sky, and the rough bricks are just exposed. And on the flanking side of the garden, this was taken like in the 70s. So this, again, this is the symmetrical image of this, very fuzzy image, but the roof is gone. Here's one column, here's part of a column, and another part there. And this looks to have been a base for a sculpture. This is a picture of the Temple of the Sky in the 70s, early 70s, before a big restoration effort that was done. And so what you see are these stairs going down with just simple pipe railings on them. They originally had elaborate stone balustrades. This is the upper level of the main walled garden. The edge of the terrace, this is down a level. This pierced stone parapet ran the entire length, like 300 feet in segments, and there had been so much vandalism that the vandals were just pushing the stones down into the garden and watching it break into pieces. Here you see, here you see a piece of the balustrade which flipped the other way, so thankfully it wasn't destroyed. This is a historic shot of the garden. I think this is 1937. This shows an interesting sculpture of Athena. Again, this is looking toward the Sphinxes. Beautiful mosaics at the base, mounted on a polychrome base. Untermeyer bought this later and put this in the center of the Temple of the Sky. This is that column today. It's in the woods, just sitting there. More sculptures, more sculptures. There were 60 full-time gardeners, and that was complemented by 60 greenhouses. It's easy to remember. It's always 60. And this was some of the 60 greenhouses. Those were actually torn down by Untermeyer himself because they were in the way of the entrance into the garden. But there was this huge battery of greenhouses, needless to say. This is one of the greenhouses in the 60s. You can just barely see, this is the framing for the greenhouse coming, and all the glass is gone, and there are trees growing through the greenhouses. This is an interesting little, again, now we've gone from the sack, now we're going back to the glory. At the bottom, this is written by a very famous, whose name I forget, a German singer who toured in New York with Richard Strauss in 1921. It's just interesting, it's social history, but it ties into the Untermeyers. At the bottom, at noon, a huge reception for Strauss given by the mayor of New York. About 15 cars rolled up in front of the Hotel St. Regis, all bearing the municipal arms at the back. There was a police convoy flanking the cars to left and right on motorbikes with sirens on the whole time. That meant that we crossed every road without having to stop. All the other cars had to stop. There were people lining the streets, and of course they all had read about the reception. Strauss traveled through New York like a king. The front of Town Hall was teeming with photographers. So that's the backdrop of she's coming to New York. So who does she visit first when she comes to New York? Look at the top. Rehearsed a bit with Strauss, first thing. 12 o'clock by car to the Samuel Untermeyers, the most beautiful country estate I have ever seen. A garden with little Greek temples, an open-air theater, and wonderful Greek archaeological finds. Max Reinhardt must put on A Midsummer Night's Dream here, blah, blah, blah. A charming setting right next to the Hudson, but very high up. Untermeyer is the most famous advocate around. Once someone paid him $300,000 not to take part in a trial. In the afternoon, I sang Strauss songs, the new ones, blah, blah, blah. Tomorrow, Mrs. Untermeyer is moving to her apartment in town, which is also on Fifth Avenue, quite near to the hotel. And we are invited again for a meal for the day after tomorrow. If it goes on like this, we'll save a lot of money. Up to now, I haven't paid for a single lunch. So this is another famous party. Again, these unbelievable events that took place. Here, by the way, is that balustrade that went down the stairs. And you can see in the distance that, in the distance, this is a conductor, an orchestra here, these people all wearing black tie, ball gowns, and these are the Isadora Duncan dancers dancing in a circle. That same year, this is 1912, some 300 people went to a performance of Mozart in the garden, in the beautiful little Greek theater. No, this is 1922. Again, the same year as the Isadora Duncan. So you've got dance, you've got orchestra, you've got opera, you've got poetry. There was a lot going on here. Now we're going to the sack. So now we're talking 60s, early 70s. This is looking back at the main entrance to the walled garden. The stones are just coming apart. This garden is only 60 years old, and it's aged like 500 years in that period. This is a closer up shot of it. It looks like people have been shooting cannonballs at it. I met a man who's pretty advanced in age, and we'll see him in a second. He came here in the early 70s. He was an engineer to do some engineering study, and these were pictures he took, which he showed to me, but the fountains were completely shot by the early 70s. So here we are back at the pool. This is what we call the Persian Pool, which is at the foot of the Temple of the Sky, looking out towards the river. There is the plinth on which stood the Apollo Belvedere. What happened was that over the years, almost like ancient Rome, people were just throwing things down, and they were using the pool as a dump. And so they put broken pieces of parapet, other flotsam and jetsam, probably municipal garbage and dirt. And that is what it looked like by 1970. Then there was an effort, the beginnings of a volunteer effort. Then there was some money that was put in by the city and the state to restore it in the 70s. These are volunteers beginning to excavate the wreckage that was in the pool. This is that man who took the pictures, who was very advanced. So he's looking up at one of the lion spouts that were the fountain that was sculpted by Frederick Roth, who was a very well-known animalier. He sculpted animals, and of course this is long gone too, but was still there then. There were a number of these Roth sculptures. That's it close up. Then all of the mosaics were redone. They got all this money from New York State, and the city put it in, and the mosaics were completely redone. There it is, when they were all installed, looking absolutely perfect, looking from the Apollo at the deep end back towards the shallow end. This was the Untermeyer swimming pool. So you can see all these beautiful sea creatures embedded in with these eddying water, almost an Art Nouveau pattern. A huge effort was, and there's been a lot of criticism of what happened in the 70s, that the restoration wasn't probably done as well as it should have, and of course the city was not able to maintain it as well as it should have afterwards, and there was tremendous deterioration after that. But what was critical is that effort that did occur in the 70s saved it, because it was so far gone at that point that the city was tempted to tear the whole garden down to make like a football field out of it. So it gave it a lease of life for another generation, the garden. So this was all the work that was done around that temple to restore it at the time. This is back in the 70s. And this was the result. This is what it looked like in the 70s. All this was new stone here. All the mosaics were redone. We see the water coming out here. The stone was all cleared. That was, again, new, all new. But of course, what happened was, this is a city park. It's not properly maintained. So, they start swimming there again. And, there's not a lifeguard there. It's supposed to be really maybe for the Untermeyers to swim in, but it's not a municipal pool. So I don't know the exact sequence, but I don't think it was too long that the city drained it again, because it was a hazard. And that's what it looks like today. So all of the mosaics are ruined, and they're all going to have to be redone. So again, this sort of weird, sort of crazy thing, we get the funniest. This was an ancient sarcophagus, and of course the people in Yonkers just call it a bathtub. Oh, we go sit in the bathtub, but this was an ancient sarcophagus, and this is a shot from probably the 60s or the 70s. Okay, that was the sack. Now we're coming back to the glory. So this is a party given by the Untermeyers in 1924. This is a famous party for 1,800 people at the end of the Democratic National Convention. Notice it's for the delegates and their wives. And it's interesting also to note that Untermeyer, who was a very famous guy himself, though, he said that his home was actually, maybe more importantly, the historic home of Samuel Tilden. And Tilden lived there after he lost the presidential election, like Hillary Clinton and Al Gore. He won the popular election. And he owned it until his death, and then Untermeyer bought it from Tilden's estate. And there was a huge rainstorm, and this is a front page article in the New York Times, where the 1,800 people had this unbelievable, disastrous bus ride up from the city. I won't get into all the details, but it was an unbelievable thing. This was the front page, top left-hand article, and not in the Metro section. This was the first page of the New York Times. Okay, back to the 70s. What was done were some new pieces, reproductions of what had been put in. Marilyn Friedman, who's in this room, this might be her or elsewhere, actually working from photographs, because they had already been stolen. There were these bronze masks of comedy and tragedy that almost looked like they were almost Etruscan or something, very sort of primitive looking design were made, and no sooner did she cast them in bronze than probably a year or two later they were stolen again. That was the clay model of what Marilyn made. There they are, right here. This is in the 1970s. This had all been redone, not painted yet, the new wood. Then again, all these ill-starred events. I mean, it just goes from one sort of sad luck story to another. This is kind of a minor one, but after they had finished this huge restoration, they were so proud of all the mosaics, and they were going to celebrate it with a Tulip Festival. So they planted, 10,000 tulips, back when you had to plant each hole by hand, and they set a date, but it was a terrible spring. It was very cold or whatever, so they had the Tulip Festival, and there were no tulips blooming. So this was taken a week after the festival took place. But it was like Ben-Hur or whatever, the Hollywood, these are actual shots from the 70s. I mean, they had these very elaborate lighting effects, very Hollywood. This tower now is no longer visible because the weeping beeches on either time have closed the gap. So you come in under this unbelievable curtain of leaves from the weeping beeches. And again, no sooner does it be restored than, these things start happening. So this was like some jamming rock and roll kids in the late 70s. This is the Gatehouse. This is the Gatehouse that man mentioned that had all the sculptures just lying on the ground, where all of the blue ribbons were sitting. This is what it looked like in Untermeyer's period. Again, this is another sad sack tale, unfortunately. By the time the 70s came around, it looked like that. But the city said, we're putting all this money into the garden, let's make a visitor center. And we ought to have all these visitors come and look at it. So they spent all this money and working on it, and there was a fire. So then they started again, and they built up the walls, and they put in more framing, they put in a new slate roof with copper, whatever, and there was a second fire. So they tore it down after that, and that's what it looked like after the second fire. There's just like nothing that they could do that would, I mean, it was, I think, partly bad luck, partly it was the time, in the 70s when there was so much vandalism. I mean, we in New York know what Central Park was like, what the Belvedere fountain was like, what much of Central Park was like. It was a disaster, and whatever disaster it was at Central Park, it was probably even more heart-wrenching in this garden. New York Yonkers couldn't afford the type of maintenance that was required. Now we're back to the glory. There was a man named Arnold Genthe, G-E-N-T-H-E, who was a very noted photographer, and we have some beautiful photographs that he took. This is of the vista. I like to imagine that one of those men is Samuel Untermeyer at the top of the stairs. This is what it looked like in Untermeyer's day, lined with cryptomeria and the beautiful paving stones with grass turf joints at the bottom. Here are the servants having fun. Again, but it's great because now we have a picture of it. That it was really great that they did what they did. That's another shot of what those stairs looking back up. This was Samuel Untermeyer's favorite feature of the garden. It was the most monumental feature of the garden based on the Villa d'Este at Lake Como. This is what those same stairs looked like by the 60s. This is a photograph taken in the 80s by a photographer from Longwood Garden. He shared his photographs with it. I saw this garden myself around 1989, and this is the bottom of the vista. This is what it looked like in my memory, except what I remember actually was there was a horseshoe set up, that there were sort of old drunks, drinking their bottles and throwing horseshoes at the bottom. But there was almost no view of the river whatsoever. Going back, this is this balustrade with a Roman grill that goes around it, and that was vandalized too. And kids or whatever broke off chunks of the Roman grill, and they just toppled down the hill, and all the way at the bottom of the hill near the Croton Aqueduct, we still see these fragments of the original balustrade. They're still there. This was taken by a friend of mine in the early 90s, so the stairs are barely visible looking up. The vines have taken almost everything. Again, looking like Angkor Wat. This is what it looked like when we started the Conservancy 6 years ago, when Timothy Tillman started working as the sole gardener. When you look down the stairs, again, were barely visible. There were weeds chest high on either side, vines hanging from the trees. So this is what it started, what it looked like in 2011. This is about as much view as you had in 2011. Timothy was just starting to clear things out then. And again, he worked single-handedly for almost 2 years. This is what it looks like today. So now we have, removed invasive trees. We planted the cryptomeria as Samuel Untermeyer intended. We're not done with it yet. We're going to be planting more plants here. We've actually put in pavers, which will have grass joints here, and the 2 columns at the bottom. These trees, of course, the trees the cryptomeria have only been in the ground for 1 year, so they will grow to be very tall and very much like the Italianate landscape we wish it to be. And here's a great shot of the columns at the bottom. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, these columns are ancient Roman monolithic columns. These are 2,000-year-old columns, imported by Stanford White. Stanford White was murdered in 1906. They were deaccessioned from his estate. We don't know exactly how. Bosworth must have known about them, and 10 years later persuaded Untermeyer to buy them. And when we say monolithic, it means they're single shafts of Cipollino marble, so they're very hard to move. And they are the finest and largest ancient columns in the Western Hemisphere. This is from a book written by Laura Starr Untermeyer, no relation. She was the wife and widow of Louis Untermeyer, the poet. And they were friends because of the poetry connection, even though they were not related. And she was talking about Edgar Spire, who was this American guy who became a naturalized British citizen, was quite the aesthete, who had visited most of the European showplaces, and he said they could rank among the finest anywhere. They had a rare beauty, which is true. This is a wonderful video that was taken in 1933. This is the first moving pictures we have of the walled garden, and it was on the occasion of a theremin performance. A theremin was a Russian instrument, very revolutionary. Here is the Apollo Belvedere. Here we are at the pool. Can't see the mosaics. This is a sculpture that used to be in front of the mansion, that was from the Rockefeller estate, was replaced by the Dancing Maidens. That is the back of the Apollo Belvedere. You can see that this is the Farnese Hercules. There's the bronze runner. And there is the gladiator. This is the performance. Steve Sherman gave this to me. I hope he's here. He is the great-great-nephew of this woman, and we believe this may be the first performance of a theremin in America. Look at this black thing in the background and her instrument. This is very interesting, and it shows that the Untermeyers were interested in avant-garde culture as well. Again, this is like 1932. This was it was an electronic instrument, almost, I don't know, like a Moog synthesizer, but it played very strange music. I don't think I've ever heard one, but if you're interested in theremin history, this is part of theremin history in America, 1932. Here are the servants again. They are at the bottom of the color gardens. The color gardens were 6 color gardens going up the hill. Of them, one is totally destroyed. There's a road under it. 2 of them are owned by the city, and 3 others we're hoping maybe to acquire from the hospital, which is next door. So this shows they were called color gardens because each was planted with a single color flower. So a white garden, a blue garden, a red garden. Each had a fountain with sculptures. So this shows, and they were all axially aligned with stairs going up the hill. So this is the bottom one. This is what that color garden looked like when Timothy started work. If you look very closely, there is the fountain, and that was where the sculpture on the fountain was based. That's what it looks like today. So nothing is planted there, but we've cleared it. Going up the hill, that parking lot in the hospital was another color garden. Then going further up the hill, 2 more gardens. You see a circular fountain, more steps going up. This circular basin is this. I was like having a Geiger counter. So I was trying to go, and it was down almost 12 inches of soil. So in like 75 years, it's almost 12 inches of soil. But that is the round diameter of the fountain that we looked at. And there are the stairs leading up to it. This is a wonderful article highlighting garden art. So painters who paint flowers. And there was something about Untermeyer. This is the only view we have of the rose and dahlia garden, which was at the bottom of the vista. So here he had, of course, this is the walled garden up above. This shows a sort of topiary or a standard rose, and see the stairs in the background. Those are the stairs. When we started work, the stairs were not visible. And last year, Stuart Molina, one of our gardeners, dug them up, and I asked him, and if you look closely, what's interesting is you can see this is what the soil level was. So it was like that. So I asked him, I said, let's go take a picture of you, Stuart. And he's holding a tape measure there, and it shows that 19 inches, the soil is 19 inches higher than what it had been in Untermeyer's day. So this is all erosion, just sort of dirt going down the hill. If you look here, this is part of the rose and dahlia complex. There were various pavilions and pergolas, which are mainly gone, and fountains. But if you look in the distance, you can see a few columns and a pergola in the background. That looked like this when we started 6 years ago, and now it looks like that. So we're sort of digging out from the jungle, gradually revealing architectural features, and actually beyond this point, which when this photograph was taken last year had not yet been cleared out. We've now cleared out the area behind it, and behind that is very interesting. We're seeing edging patterns. And so here we see sort of a double circle in steel edging going around. It must have been a very interesting garden bed. This is a sculpture of, we now believe to be Neptune. It was very heavily damaged, and Marilyn Friedman, again, who's here, tried to piece it together in the 70s when she was just like in college. She's still a practicing sculptor, and she made a form to put on top of the terracotta, the bottom part, and it was, the city was unable to secure additional funding, and the sculpture was lost. She also did another sculpture for the missing, what we thought was a horse head, down at the aqueduct, and it was, that was the building that had the fire, and the whole building collapsed on her sculpture that she was making, so that was destroyed too. Again, sort of the sad sack history of what happened in the 70s. Adjacent to the Rose and Dahlia gardens were what we call the Long Garden. And the ancient columns will be right behind here, the Hudson River's on the right. So there's stairs going up, and then these little bitty stairs. So most of this garden, it's all gone. Much of it has been destroyed because there's a nursing home that's been built. But the last flight of stairs, we saw just traces of it. There was a huge tree growing on top of the stairs. So we cut down the tree. It was like almost a 3-foot diameter. This was taken last week with there's snow on the ground. But this is the only remnant we have of those stairs. These, at the end of the Rose and Dahlia gardens, was a third chain of gardens called the Italian gardens. And they were ornamental vegetable gardens. They were terracing going down the river. Now we're looking up north towards the Tappan Zee. There was a circular fountain that emptied in. At each level there was a marble base, stairs going down, marble basin, rill, stairs, marble basin, rill, down, rill, going down 5 levels. That's what it looked like. By the way, these pavilions are very similar to pavilions at Kaiket, same architect. This is what it looked like in the day, so you can see those rills going down towards the river, much more open view. This is what it looks like now. So that is the top fountain, only the top level. The other 5 levels, these are the stairs going down. There's another little fountain here, but then the nursing home was built right on top of the rest of the Italian gardens about 10 years ago, very unfortunately. There is the one basin. In the retaining wall, there was a big carved stone ornament, of course, like the sack of Rome. The Vandals chipped it out and stole it. At the bottom of the Italian gardens, and I remember this back in the 90s before the nursing home was built, that was a lower pool, and under it was a pump house, and in that pump house was the famous Devil's Cave. If you go home and Google Untermeyer and Son of Sam, David Berkowitz, lived in Yonkers. He hung out in the garden, and there was its decayed environment appealed to his diseased mind. And this was a place where he and other people hung out. There was a satanic, occult stuff happening, and really sort of sinister stuff. At the top of the Italian Gardens was another big rock formation, sort of like our Temple of Love, and the hospital is built right on top of it. So the hospital is higher up and the nursing home's below. Okay, back to glory. This is a telegram that we just discovered in the University of Pennsylvania. It's hard to read, but it's from Untermeyer to Marian Anderson. In 1937, he became the president of the Non-Sectarian Anti-Nazi League, which was the leading opposition movement to Hitler, really, not only in America, but in Europe. And he was really the face of resistance to Adolf Hitler. And it was for a fundraiser at Carnegie Hall, and he asked her if she could perform. Unfortunately, she couldn't. But again, it just shows his contacts in the music world. His wife had already died, but he was still at it. This is a great shot that we have of Anne Carmel's mother on the left, bicycling through the garden in the early 30s with Marion Sulzberger High School. Marion High School is one of her best friends, a childhood friend, was Anne's mother, and the Sulzbergers and Untermeyers were friends. And you can see her dark pigtails. What is this? Oh, this is I'm an architect. So in 1932, height of the Depression, this is when the Isadora Duncan dancers came back. This is an article about the benefit for unemployed architects that was held. And the hostesses, the people who know architectural history, Mrs. Joseph Urban, Mrs. Robert Carrere, Mrs. John Mead Howells, Mrs. Harvey Wiley Corbett, Mrs. Charles Adams Platt, Mrs. James Gamble Rogers. So these are the wives of the most prominent architects of the day having a party with the Isadora Duncan dancers to raise money for unemployed architects. And this is Irma Duncan at that party. This is this fabulous photograph of the Temple of Love. This is the Temple of Love at the top, back in the 30s. This is in the 70s when it had gone to rack and ruin. John Lennon came. One of his photographer who worked with him knew his girlfriend lived in Yonkers and said, "There's this really ruined environment in Yonkers, John. You want to come take a look at it?" And he said, "Sure." And he took that picture. And so this is the Temple of Love. So this was taken 40 years ago. So it was looking pretty bad then, but it was even in worse shape until recently. That's what it looked like in the early 90s when I visited it in the first time. And that's what it looks like now. So last year, the Temple of Love was restored. The base of the temple itself had to be completely redone, but the dome is the original iron dome. All the waterfalls and cataracts have been restored, and it is absolutely stupendous. Even though we're only starting to plant it, it is very impressive, even as it is with all the waterfalls.
Have you ever been kicked by a melon? That may seem to be a silly question, but it certainly isn't out of the question on an estate at Yonkers, New York City. For it's here that horticulturist George Chisholm is experimenting with alcoholic fruit. Any port in the storm isn't good enough for our George. He wants his port, and vintage port if it comes to that, in a melon.
So this is the British newsreel, maybe the British sense of humor. But Untermeyer he loved the fact that 30,000 people came in one day, and he would try to do gimmicks every year. What could he do to top himself from the previous year? So one year, this is again like 1939, he had the idea of infusing honeydew melons with liqueur. I think, in fact, one of the reasons why 30,000 people came was to see these honeydew melons. And it hit, it hit the press here. But this was in 1939. We have one more period video, so we're really lucky to have 3 period moving pictures of what the garden looked like and seeing people moving through them. So a few years before that, he, on Untermeyer, this is well after Bosworth's period, decided he wanted to build the world's largest living horticultural sundial, and to get more people to come here. So this is an article that was written about it. And who is this? Who is that in the picture? I always said, that's not your grandfather, is it? So this is, I've always said it was Samuel Untermeyer, but I don't really think it is. But it is somebody who is setting his watch by the sundial here. And so here you can see all the numerals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all in flowers and stones with the dial here. This was the living horticultural sundial back, when it was new, and this is what it looks like now. So this, the only remnant is this crummy little sort of pipe railing on either side. There's another one there, which suggests where it was. It's totally overgrown. In the fullness of time, we will see fit to restore it. Then adjacent to that is the rock garden, which is something that Untermeyer built also in the 30s. It's beautifully photographed in the Smithsonian Archives in Washington through the Garden Club of America. It was spectacular. It was completely overgrown with, like the other pictures. We don't have a photograph of it. I went to Washington to look at these pictures, and it said Untermeyer Gardens on it. And I was like, I didn't know where they were. I had no idea. And I was talking to Timothy, and we were kind of looking at the way the ground sloped and where the shadows were, and we thought that maybe that it was in a certain area, and they started digging up, and we dug up this rock garden. So this is what it looked like in the 30s, and after having been dug up, this is what it looks like now. So this is the bench, and this is where that totem pole was here. So that was that. So that was pretty interesting. And then there was another shot here. Again, these little waterfall cascades, rocks, and beautiful little bridges going down. And we dug up and we found that. So this, we believe we're going to get a New York State grant that will restore this, possibly next year. But then there's the issue of planting it. So, there's a lot on our agenda and a lot of exciting things that will be coming. Back again down the hill. So below the ancient columns is the Gatehouse. And this was at the lower entrance along the Old Croton Aqueduct and Warburton Avenue going down to the Hudson River. When we started, the Gatehouse was not visible except for this little bit. It's too bad we don't have a proper shot of it, but there was a fallen oak tree of enormous girth on top of the Gatehouse, and vines growing everywhere. So it just looked like a lump of greenery with this little thing popping out from it. That's what it looks like now. We removed the tree, removed the vines, and we've now stabilized it. You can see the workers working there. We've got lead-coated copper flashing and steel and timber holding it up. This is going to become it is a stabilized ruin, and it's going to become a ruin garden. You will walk through the ruin to get up to the gardens. So that is the Gatehouse from below, covered in graffiti. Our intent is to remove the graffiti on the outside, but possibly to leave the graffiti or something like graffiti on the inside to speak to its history, And that's just sort of a general comment that I think we're going to try to be sensitive about. Is there's certain romance to all the jungle and everything that was growing over it, and we don't want it to be too perfect. So like right now, the Temple of Love is scrubbed down pretty well, but I think we really want to plant things that will make it kind of overhanging with a profusion of greenery. And once we remove the vines, once we remove the graffiti on this building, we want to plant vines to grow up it again, to sort of hang down and feel like you're coming into this beautiful Tarzan-like world. But what's not Tarzan-like are these sculptures. Oops, wait a second. At the base. So this is obviously a lion covered in graffiti. The masonry here had collapsed. We had to rebuild it. And there is a headless horse. We rebuilt the column last year, so that looks pretty good now. We removed a lot of trees that were overhanging, so now you can actually see the relationship between this and the ancient columns behind. So here's the lion, and here's the headless horse. And Marilyn Friedman actually had worked on a replacement for the head of the horse, and that's the thing that was destroyed when the carriage house collapsed in the fire. So that's gone. So that is what it looked like. That's the only photograph we have of the headless horse when it had a head. In the 30s, looking through the wrought iron gate, there is the horse. So we know it kind of looked around that way. So Barbara Israel called me a couple months ago, and she was always looking at auction catalogs all over the world for garden ornaments. That's her business. And she said, Steve, I think that this might... Someone had told us that they thought that the sculptures were sculpted by Edward Clark Potter, who sculpted the two lions in front of the New York Public Library, 5th Avenue and 42nd Street. But then Barbara was saying, you know, she thought they were not American, that they were English, and that they were part of the royal coat of arms. And this is what she sent me. This is something that was being, I think a fragment was being auctioned off. So this was, again, the coat of arms. This is Honi soit qui mal y pense. And the lion is a symbol of England. And what Barbara said was, she thought it was not only was it not Edward Clark Potter, but it wasn't a horse, that it was a unicorn, because the unicorn was the symbol of Scotland. Of course, we don't know. And then we looked at that picture, right, from the 30s, there's no horn, right? So then Barbara said she was doing research on unicorns. And unicorns, obviously, they're mythological creatures. They're half deer and they're half horse with the horn, right? And so, but they have a cloven hoof, right, because they're part deer. So I said, thank you very much, and I hung up the phone, and I started working, and then all of a sudden, bing, the light went on in my head. I said, wait a second, I think the horse, the head isn't down there, but the hoof is. We now know that it was a unicorn, and that it was English, and they built these sculptures, sometimes on tops of palaces or something, to signify the grandeur of the British Empire. And somehow, when Untermeyer got it, maybe the horn had broken off, but we know it was a unicorn. And we will rebuild it, and we'll build just a little stub of a horn, just so we know that it was not a horse. So that was really pretty interesting, and thanks to Barbara on that. From a view, again, just showing the kind of digging out from the jungle that Timothy and the others have done, and they're all here, by the way. This is looking from the Gatehouse up the Carriage Trail. The Carriage Trail is about a mile long, sweeping up through the woods, and it had not been maintained in over a generation. No one in probably a generation was able to walk on it. I mean, I tried, and this is what it looked like 6 years ago. And Timothy and maybe one other person made it look like this. As you go up the Carriage Trail, you come to the first big switchback, and there's a ruined fountain there. We've had various Boy Scout groups earning Eagle Scout awards who've helped clear things out, and it's beginning to take definition. And what's nearby is this. And it's still very mysterious, but they're big blocks of granite that are stairs that lead up to a foundation, a rectangular foundation. This is actually the underside of one of the treads. So someone knocked the tread over and flipped it over. I mean, it's very, very, very heavy. And the best that I can think, and it's a total conjecture, is that it might have been the base for this. The Temple of Love, Bosworth designed a rectangular Greek temple. These are the servants. So thanks to the servants, they're back again. I think it was built out of wood, and it didn't last that long, and Untermeyer later bought the round temple with the dome on top of it. But my guess is, so this was Bosworth. My thinking is it's possible that the stairs leading up to that temple might have been very massive granite riser treads, and that he relocated the temple down there, but it's just total conjecture. Wait a second. How do I stop this? Okay. I'll go back. This is the last video, and I'm almost to the end. But I have to tell you about this before we start. So 1946 is when finally the Untermeyer family surrenders the 16 acres out of the 150 acres to the city of Yonkers. So up until that time, the garden was pretty well maintained. There was a very well-known, and I didn't know her before, avant-garde filmmaker named Aeneas Nin. And she was pretty wild, and she heard about this garden. And if you Google her, you'll find that she had a connection with Gore Vidal. And Gore Vidal was a young guy, and she was, maybe he was 21 or so, and she was 42. And she, I think, kind of liked him romantically. He was gay, so this was not going to go anywhere particularly. But he's in this brief snippet. So we're going to start. I'm not showing the whole thing, but the first part is sort of this cocktail party, seeing all these people in the city on the Upper East Side drinking and smoking, and then there's a dream sequence when you go into the garden. So I will show you. I'll point out Gore Vidal. Let's see, I'm going back. That's him. That's him. Now we're going to the dream sequence. So this is 1946. Bronze Boy, Farnese Hercules, Bronze Runner, I should say. Dancing Maidens in Central Park. Not quite done. So anyway, now we come to the present. I started the Conservancy 6 years ago, originally as its chair and a volunteer, and it slowly took over my life, and I left my architecture firm and now work at the garden full time. Timothy, who was alone originally, now there's 7 people working with him, most of whom are here, and thankfully we have a very good relationship working with the city of Yonkers. It's a classic public-private partnership where we raise lots of money from the private sector, and we pump it back into this great garden, which is owned by the city of Yonkers. And it's really been a terrific story. And so in conclusion, I want to say that I began this lecture with an image from Angkor Wat, and we'll conclude it with one from the Roman Forum. After the sack of Rome by Alaric in August of 410, its citizens began to repair the damage to the eternal city. The 2 pedestals shown here were part of that effort. Just as Samuel Untermeyer predicted in 1939, his garden should not be considered a local matter. He wanted to create the finest garden in the world, and it will take the attention of a great many people throughout the world to resurrect it. As Edgar Speyer said, this garden possesses a rare beauty. 75 years later, the Conservancy, working with the city of Yonkers and people like you, is making great progress. In the fullness of time, I wonder what will become of this empty pedestal. Thank you very much.